What's your view of her in general and of Mrs. Dalloway in particular? I mean, how great was she, do you think?
I think she was terrific, actually. I mean, I think that she in many ways, reinvented the novel, at least put it on a kind of recognisable 20th century track after the Victorians and the Edwardians. The great thing with her is, summed up in that declaration, she said, you've got to look within, she said,
Yes.
and write about people's consciousness. As surrounded by wonderful everyday detail. And
She
that's
made
what
it
she
much
did.
easier for the reader than Joyce did, didn't she? I mean, her books are easier than...
Certainly, certainly. Though she admired greatly the first parts of Ulysses, she said the graveyard scene in Ulysses was exactly the kind of thing she wanted to write. But as that novel went on, she came to hate it, and she deplored its sexiness and so on. But she did admire the inwardness of Joyce, but she took it further than him. I mean that's her great thing, presenting people with their thoughts and so on exposed on the page, and wonderfully so, terrific intimacy with what's going on inside people's heads. At the same time, giving you them in response to terrific everyday detail. Mrs. Dalloway is set in London, and you get this tremendous sense of 1920s London. Now, a lot of it is very posh London, and you can complain about Virginia Woolf's obsession with the upper bourgeoisie and the aristocracy and posh intellectuals and so on and so on. But leaving that aside, I mean the way in which she presents people within a terrifically realised social context. It's not surprising she admired a lot of modernist painters like Cézanne. I mean, the colour in her work is terrific, and that's what's good about her. Now, of course, she did go mad. Of course she did, but there's no sign, I think, of that madness in Mrs. Dalloway, like there is in some novels. There are some of her early novels where you think she was mad writing this passage. It's kind of frenzied and
Of course,
insane.
she had bouts of madness all the way
She
through.
certainly did, and she did say about writing Mrs. Dalloway that it hurt her head. She was thinking of the way in which she kind of weaves things together, a terrific weaving process. The detail is extraordinary in the way in which she puts it all together. That's the sense in which it hurt her head. It's not that she was going bonkers at the time, unhappily. I mean, there are signs of her kind of melancholy and her obsession with death through the novel, and she's a person who will have a character look at her bread knife and think about killing herself and so on. And not accidentally, this novel, Mrs. Dalloway, opens with Mrs. Dalloway coming through the door of her house into the London street and thinking of what it was like to run down the beach into the water and feeling the kiss of the wave, which is an extraordinary kind of memory, an extraordinary kind of feeling. But you can't help thinking of that, of the way in which eventually she would walk into the River Thames and drown herself.
Yeah. On that detail, when you did an introduction to, I think, the Vintage Classics edition, you quote a passage quite early on. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp and trudge, in the bellow and uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, etc., etc. I mean, that way of bringing London to life. And you talk about the wonderful radical thinginess of, and it's that, isn't it? That contrast between that on the one hand and the fact that people's impressions the character's impressions of it are also skewed and slightly odd.
Yeah, yeah. And of course it is true that the reality of London is very threatening. That is to say, Mrs. Dalloway, thinking about cars on the street, is also thinking about being run over by them. And this novel has got a character who is mad, Septimus Warren Smith, who is a victim of the war. It's a very war-conscious book, and he represents, as it were, somebody who's having kind of nightmares and bad dreams about the war, and eventually, of course, he falls through a window. There's some debate about whether he's kind of pushed or jumped or whatever. He's obsessed by a doctor who visits him. Anyway, he falls to his death on the railings, and the railing, a spike goes up through him. And Mrs. Dalloway, when she hears about this, she feels at our party, she feels that spike going up through her, and in a sense it represents the way in which Virginia Woolf's, this novel and all her novels are, as it were, penetrated. They're pierced by grief, especially brought on by the memory of the First World War and men she knew who had died, and all of that, and a whole nation of men who had died, and she is pierced with grief, as Mrs. Dalloway is pierced by that hearing of that talk of the railing, and in that sense, what is kind of extraordinary, it seems to me, is the way in which Virginia Woolf makes you aware of life, the living, and being alive, though conscious of and surrounded all the time by talk of death and actual death. And of course, this is one of the great post-First World War novels. It's very striking how so much modernist fiction is actually written at this moment, like Eliot's Wasteland and so on. And this is one of the great ones. But what's very striking is it's not cast down in that melancholy, and it gives us, in a sense, a person triumphing. There she was. There she was. Yes, is the last word. And the novel gives you this there-ness of a living person, living, as it were, triumphantly in the face of mortality.
I mean, it is a novel in a way about what it feels like to be alive, isn't it? I mean, and the balance between sanity and insanity being really quite small, so that you see Mrs. Dalloway on the one hand and Septimus on the other, but they're not as unalike as we might think. Do you agree with that? That they're both, that there is a sort of delicate balance between the two, between sanity and insanity, she's suggesting.
Not so much sanity and insanity, it seems to me, as between melancholy and brightness. I mean, that's the axis of this fiction. It is extraordinarily melancholic at the same time as being extraordinarily alive, and it marks it out. It's the kind of a novel of a survivor of the terrible traumas of the First World War. A woman, not a man. You know, there are plenty of soldier fiction, but people who actually came through the trenches and all the rest of it. She's an onlooker as a woman, but what an onlooker at this extraordinary cultural moment.
Yes. And that whole mock heroic thing, I suppose, which is played within Ulysses, goes further with Mrs. Dalloway, which is deliberately Mrs. Dalloway, isn't it? And you have a heroine, and the main thing she's doing is giving a party.
And she is indeed Mrs. Dalloway, and that is deliberate because, of course, Virginia Woolf is a feminist and a strong feminist, and it's very important that she should be presenting her heroine as a married woman, a woman who is up against the male world And you know, she's surrounded by all of these kind of, if you like, ruling class males. I mean, her husband is a member of the cabinet and so on. And okay, so there are potent women who do things backstage in this novel. They are powers behind the parliamentary throne and all the rest of it. But this is a woman's story within a very male world. And of course, that male world, this is one of the things that obsesses Virginia Woolf, that male world is a world that has sent so many boys to their death.
Was it? I think it was J. Hillis Miller who said that for Virginia Woolf, a novel was the place of death made visible, or some remark. So that, in a way, is what you're talking about with the melancholy. But I suppose and there she was. It does end on a slightly upbeat note, Mrs. Dalloway.
Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, and that is its point, as it were. The continuing presence of the person. Despite everything, you know, and there are signs all around of death. You know, there's a wonderful incident where Mrs. Dalloway sees a troop of soldiers going off to the cenotaph, that First World War memorial. You're very conscious of bad things, mortal things out there. I mean, there's this very interesting episode, isn't there, with the guy who's come back from India, and he has been some sort of failure out there, and he comes in.
He wants to marry her.
Yeah, right. Always, he's in love with her, and he a wonderful scene where he comes and he watches her sewing her dress, and he has a penknife which he can't open, and so on. It's a kind of indication of kind of failed phallic power of this guy. Meanwhile, she is triumphantly kind of sewing and cutting and so on, and wielding these kind of male phallic implements, needles and scissors and so on, doing it very quietly while she does a very woman thing, sewing and cutting her dress. And where has he come from? He's come from India. He's come from out there. He's a colonial administrator. Lots of those in Virginia Woolf's novels, and he's had some sort of failure. She's alive. She's alive, and triumphant. He is a complete failure. He can't open his penknife. Okay, and he represents, as it were, the male world, male colonialism, and so on.